back, fellow literature lovers. My name is Tara, and this is my next video for my English 750 class, Topics in Textual Criticism, which includes information, literacy, and revolution across the 14th century. We're next going to dive into the realm of Arthurian legend with Book 1 and 2 of Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485 by William Caxton. And you might remember that Caxton was the same gentleman that published the Golden Legend in my first video. So, I never read Malory's work before, which made this class module particularly exciting to me. I do enjoy the legend of King Arthur, such as the classic Sword in the Stone movie, or even the board game Shadows over Camelot, which is a board game my friends and I play about the Knights of the Round Table and questing for Excalibur and the Holy Grail and defending Camelot from attackers. So that's a nice connection. Alright, so for this week's deep dive, I wanted to discuss the portrayal of women within the first two books of Morte d'Arthur, and its also connection to knightly honor and chivalry. First, it's important to mention that Malory used a stanzaic poem for much of his source material on King Arthur, and that source material was titled Morte Arthur, and it was by an anonymous author. So during the Middle Ages, one sign of being a good king was listening to counsel. And to set the stage, in this influential stanzaic source material, King Arthur trusts Guinevere's opinion and even asks for her advice in matters of court and his honor, valuing not only her thoughts, but also her as a person to some degree. Which, this listening to counsel indicated that he was a good ruler during this time. However, Malory looked at this source material and decided, nah, that ain't me, and didn't want to do none of that valuing women stuff, at least at this point in the book. So let's jump into it. For my analysis, it seems that women can be broken down into three categories thus far within the text: cheaters, evil enchantresses, and good women. So, even though men seem to cheat all the time in the narrative, if you're a woman and cheat, you're just a horrible person. Sorry. And if you try to have any sort of autonomy in really any other regard, then you're a witch or an enchantress or a sorceress. However, if you just listen and do what you're told by the men in your life and just let them do as they wish without complaint, then the narrative's kind of saying you're a good woman. And this all just begins on page 1 of the book, when King Uther Pendragon wanting to have sexual relations with a duke's wife named Igraine. However, quote, she is a passing good woman and would not assent unto the king, end quote, showing her loyal, faithful, and chaste qualities, even in the face of a king's demand. She even suspects that the king invited her and her husband, the duke, there in the first place to dishonor her, and tells her husband that they must leave. Since this duke is an honorable man, he listens to his wife, and they fled the would-be attacker. However, King Uther just can't seem to take no for an answer, because he views Igraine as some kind of property or conquest, opposed to a person, and literally starts a war over this rejection, stopping at nothing to have sexual relations with this married woman. It's ironic because cheating seems to be one quality that's absolutely not tolerated in a woman during this period. But it seems, perfectly acceptable for a man to try to force a married woman to have sex with them. I guess they don't care as long as it's not their own wife cheating, because, that's not hypocritical. Anyway, so this results in King Uther taking on the likeness of Igraine's husband and essentially sexually assaulting her by pretending to be her husband when he wasn't, and thus coercing her against her will, showing just an extreme lack of morals, respect, and decency. Merlin was also in on this too, as he orchestrated these events and helped Uther accomplish it. However, Igraine maintains her good woman status because she doesn't speak out about the situation and, quote, mourned privately and held her peace, end quote, knowing unfortunately that speaking out would probably have grave consequences for her. So, since Igraine took this treatment from the men in her life, she was considered a good woman. However, the fact that King Uther would put her in this position shows his own lack of honor and goodness. Furthermore, this horrible situation with King Uther raping a woman, not respecting boundaries, starting a war over it because someone turned him down for sex, wasn't as surprising to me when I found out that Thomas Malory himself was accused of raping a woman twice in the year 1450, which for me kind of informs some of the troublesome portrayals of women in this piece. Specifically, Malory was, quote, accused of breaking into the house of Hugh Smith of Monk's Kirby in 1450, stealing 40 pounds worth of goods and raping Smith's wife. And he was accused of attacking her again 8 weeks later, end quote. It's also important to mention, though, that, quote, a charge of rape could also apply to consensual sex with a married woman whose husband had not agreed to the liaison, end quote, during this period. So we can't say for certain, what Malory actually did, if he forcibly raped someone, or if he had sex with another man's wife and she consented. So, to kind of circle back to this knightly honor and chivalry, so in the face of these heinous acts, I started to wonder what was honorable about some of these men. Even King Arthur, who's King Uther's son, had a problematic relationship with women thus far in the book, not showing much regard or respect for them. As mentioned before, we don't yet see him consulting and respecting his wife Guinevere, as in the stanzaic version, though that could be coming later in the tale. And we don't see King Arthur valuing her much at all, since she's only mentioned a couple lines thus far of how they fell in love and got married with, quote, and there had Arthur the first sight of Guinevere, the king's daughter of Camelard, and even after he loved her, and they wedded, as it telleth in the book, end quote. So they got married. Cool. However, 6 days before he allegedly fell in love with Guinevere, he was having relations with another woman and, quote, setting his love greatly up to her, end quote. That would be Lyonors, who, during that first encounter there, actually conceived Arthur's first child. Then, not long after that, though shortly after Arthur was married to Guinevere, he had sex with another woman, King Lot's wife, as he, quote, cast great love onto her, and desired to lie by her, end quote. He would have another child with this lover, a woman that just so happened to be his half-sister, though he didn't know that at the time. So, the connection I am making with this is, what kind of honor and chivalry is all this? Is it certainly not respectful and honorable to Arthur's wife, or for King Uther to be respectful of Igraine? I can't get over the double standard, how cheating women are like the bane of the earth, yet men can regularly get away with it without consequence. In fact, I'm sure it's kind of expected. And Igraine and Guinevere knew probably full well what was going on with their husbands, but didn't speak up due to the status quo during this period. Thus, since they were kind of quiet about it, they probably, were considered good women. Another woman that's described as good and loyal in the text is the woman that killed herself on Lancer's sword after he was killed, as she showed her extreme love and dedication to the knight by killing herself. What kind of message is this? That women should sacrifice their lives, their emotional and mental well-being, and ultimately their bodies to their male lovers and men in general? On the other hand, what happens if a woman acts as men frequently do during this era, with cheating on their partners? So, when a knight named Garnish finds that his lover is with another knight, he just flies into a rage and kills both her and the knight, further illustrating this extreme double standard. Adultery is normal for men, but it's a literal death sentence for women, because they're considered property of their husbands and cannot have any autonomy outside of that, it seems. Acting as their husbands would act would just be unacceptable. And a lot of men in these stories don't seem to have enough respect to be faithful towards their wives. And if a woman shows even more autonomy than just selecting a new lover, such as the Lady of the Lake or the damsel that sought revenge with the sword in the sheath, they're just considered witches and sorceresses and enchantresses. the men will find any excuse to make that particular woman look as horrible as possible. For example, Balin calls the Lady of the Lake, quote, the untruest lady living, and by enchantment and sorcery she hath been the destroyer of many good knights, end quote, trying to make the case that this woman is just irredeemable since she takes matters into her own hands. And because surely many knights have killed and resorted to violence, but it's heinous and evil magic if a woman does it. So additionally, the damsel is also referred to by Merlin as, quote, the falsest damsel that liveth, end quote, because she wanted to get revenge on her brother for killing her lover. Why is she the horrible person here for wanting revenge, when it was her brother that started it by killing her lover? Balin is allowed to get revenge for his deceased mother, but this damsel is a horrible person for wanting revenge for her lover? The story is just full of double standards between men and women, which is apparent by how they condemn women for doing the same things that men do. Ultimately, the only good woman, it seems, is a woman that doesn't act in the ways men do, and men are supposed to be the ones that are honorable and chivalrous in this tale. Ultimately, in this story, the men do not take honorable advice from women as in the stanzaic source material, but King Arthur frequently instead takes counsel from Merlin. That is a whole other problematic realm with the strange advice that Merlin gives, though. Perhaps the men in the story would do better if they did take counsel from the women of the realm. For example, when Balin ignored the advice of the damsel with the sword in the sheath, and he pays for it by murdering his brother and getting killed himself. So, where does this all leave the honorable men of Camelot and the women of the realm? Are the men as chivalrous as we picture when thinking of Arthurian romance? Well, I looked up the definition for chivalry, which, to me as a modern reader, chivalry has a lot of romantic connotations, but didn't seem to as much in the 14th and 15th century. Instead, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, chivalry means, quote, the knightly system of feudal times, with its attendant religious, moral, and social code, usages, and practices, end quote. So, does this moral and social code cover treating women with respect, which the men in Book 1 and 2 seem to forgo? Well, I looked up a medieval scholar, Richard Caper, and he states that, quote, few medieval texts describing chivalry warned against burning or looting towns or raping common women. That style of warfare was still endemic during the 100 Years' War of the 14th and 15th century, where England and France fought each other, laying waste to the countryside, end quote. So, to be chivalrous during this period, you didn't even have to necessarily abstain from raping and pillaging. By that definition, maybe some of these knights were honorable and chivalrous if it really doesn't include that. However, the portrayal of women during this section of the book still leaves something to be desired. As described, they really only fall into the categories of these good women, these cheaters, or these enchantresses, with the last two being condemned for trying to have any agency or power over their own lives. Sadly, the women were viewed as property, and as men could still be honorable even if they treated them poorly, that's kind of a negative precedent to set. Sadly, at this point in the book, there also isn't much character development for the women either, as most are quickly mentioned and then never referred to again. They're almost background characters to further the male-driven plot of the narrative. However, I haven't read the entire book yet, so perhaps it'll surprise me later on. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you again for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.